So before we get started today, I should just probably mention that this is the last thing I'll be filming in here because I'm moving out of this space that I've been filming in for the past however long. That's the desk where it all happened. Some people were trying to say it was like a closet or something. Nah, it's a desk. This room is just tiny. That's my roommate's stuff. Don't bother with that. Everything's all over the place just because it's fucking messy. But yeah, I'll see you when I have a fresh haircut and a Kigu. The cowlicks are going fucking crazy. On second thought, it might actually be way too hot for this thing. So, this is a video about jazz, which I love. And no, I'm not going to be making that joke. It's the genre of music that I feel has the highest levels of musician-to-musician interplay with a really heavy emphasis on improvisation and utmost creativity. Not to say that other genres of music are less creative, it's just that jazz is creative in a way that I find really satisfying as a musician and as a listener. The unfortunate thing is that the genre seems to be declining in popularity at a really rapid rate, so in order to alleviate this, I thought I would give you all a quick rundown of some albums that I think are really good if you're trying to get into jazz and want to listen to jazz and learn how to enjoy it and appreciate it as much as I do. So this list is going to go from the 1930s up to the present day, and I'm going to list off just a bunch of records. But if you stick around to the end, I'll give you the 5 that I would say are the best starting points. So the cliche answer to the question, what jazz album do I start with, is usually Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. And, you know, it's an amazing record, of course, I'm not going to deny that. But I will say that it's really hard to understand why this album is such a classic if you don't understand what was happening in jazz up to the point that it was released. So what was happening in jazz up to this point? Well, there were two styles that were sort of contrasting with one another up until 1959. The predominant style from the 20s and on was swing, which is that kind of old-timey stuff, and a really good album for that is this Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall show from 1938. So this was the first performance by a jazz group in Carnegie Hall, fun fact. And it was recorded as the transitional period from the old school swing style to the newer style of popular music that came out of the tradition of the Great American Songbook was starting to be solidified. So as the 40s came around, there were a bunch of new styles of jazz that were coming around and making their marks, but the format of the long play record wasn't really solidified until the 50s, so we're gonna jump pretty much right to there. Don't worry, you're not going to be missing too much. So, a really good album to understand where a lot of the Great American Songbook repertoire comes from and what it sort of sounded like in a more popular idiom is In the Wee Small Hours by Frank Sinatra. It borders on being a pop album or an easy listening album, but there's a lot of really great recordings of songs here that would become jazz standards later. And another really great album in this regard is this collaborative album by Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, backed by the Oscar Peterson Trio. Louis Armstrong is often said to be the most important figure in all of jazz music, and I have a hard time disputing that myself. Ella and Louis are two of the most important jazz singers of all time, and Louis is one of the most important jazz trumpeters of all time, so you're really getting a lot of bang for your buck when you put this one on. And if you want more in this style, they also had an album together called Porgy and Bess after the George Gershwin show, which is also very good. Now, if Louis Armstrong is jazz's most important figure, then a close second would be Duke Ellington. I would be remiss not to mention anything by Duke, so I'm gonna recommend you this one called Such Sweet Thunder. It's a 12-part suite based on the works of William Shakespeare. It's got that signature, like, Duke Ellington, Billy Strayhorn big band sound that can be really in your face at times, or sometimes it's just really laid back, and other times it's just utterly breathtaking. And so if Duke Ellington is the second most important jazz figure, then a close third is Charlie Parker, who plays on this album, Jazz at Massey Hall. And this is where we start to talk about bebop, which became an increasingly popular style among musicians in the late 40s and early 50s. So this is possibly the greatest live recording of the bebop era. Charlie Parker on alto saxophone, Dizzy Gillespie on the trumpet, Charles Mingus on bass, Bud Powell at the piano, and Max Roach on the kit. These are 5 of the most important musicians in this new era of the jazz sound that came around, especially around the 50s. A lot of the tunes on this session or live album or whatever you want to call it are jazz standards as well, but they don't come out of the Great American Songbook as much as they come out of the bebop musicians themselves. There's tunes here by Dizzy Gillespie, there's tunes here by Charlie Parker, there's stuff by Thelonious Monk. One of Miles Davis's most famous quotes about jazz is that you could tell its history in 4 words: Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker. And it's kind of true in a way. Parker's biggest achievement was creating this entire new style of improvisation that became, in one way, the predominant new style, but it also received a lot of flack from the older school of musicians. I forget who it was that said that playing bebop is like playing Scrabble without the vowels, but it's a much more rhythmically and harmonically complex style than what you might find on older recordings by Coleman Hawkins or Lester Young or somebody like that. So Miles Davis played with Charlie Parker from a young age when he was first getting his start on the scene, and by the time the late 40s and early 50s rolled around, he was making his mark as a band leader and a unique voice on his instrument. He pioneered the style called cool jazz, and you can check out Birth of the Cool for that. And he released albums with his Miles Davis Quintet and a bunch of other different groups right up to 1959 when Kind of Blue was released, and now we can talk about Kind of Blue. The innovation of Kind of Blue comes down to its simplicity. I'm gonna put up the chord changes here for the tune How High the Moon, a classic jazz standard over here, and then compare this to the changes for So What, which is the first song on Kind of Blue. So What and Kind of Blue in general was really the first big step in modal jazz. And in modal jazz, rather than chord progressions, the music and harmony is all determined by modes. And there are plenty of resources out there on YouTube that can explain that in a much easier way than I ever could. So I'll link a few of those if anybody's interested in the theory behind the sound. This is another really great lineup of musicians on here. Miles Davis on trumpet, Cannonball Adderley on alto saxophone, the great John Coltrane on the tenor saxophone, who I'll be talking about a bit later, and they are supported by a rhythm section of Bill Evans, Jimmy Cobb, and Paul Chambers, and Wynton Kelly's actually on one track too. Really the most important musician on this album besides Miles himself is Bill Evans. As a pianist, he really created the entire sound of this album just with his voicings and his whole approach to the piano. The big innovations on his part were those block chords, like the So What chord, which is a famous chord voicing, and also these really lush, impressionistic sort of harmonies that he'll employ on a tune like Blue and Green. This was one of 4 albums that came out in 1959 that represent 4 distinct sounds that would all go on to create new musical movements in their own right. These are the 4 albums that we're talking about in this documentary over here, which will also be linked in the description. It's a really interesting watch, but we're going to talk about the other 3 albums from the documentary because they're all really intriguing and interesting and fun. So next we're going to talk about Mingus by Charles Mingus, a prolific jazz bassist who, if you remember, also played at the Jazz at Massey Hall show. His signature style from around this time combines the bebop idiom with a lot more blues and gospel and spiritual elements, and that wound up being a really increasingly popular idea in jazz after this album and increasingly in Mingus's own career. I like to describe it as like what jazz would sound like if it was played in like a Baptist church. The next one is a West Coast kind of cool laid-back album, Dave Brubeck's Time Out. This is where Take 5 comes from, which is the best-selling jazz single of all time. The concept of the album is that every song, or at least most of the songs, are based on odd time signatures, like Blue Rondo a la Turk is in 9/8, Take 5 is in 5/4. There are songs here in 6/4 and other interesting signatures. It's totally steeped in like the West Coast sort of cool idiom, especially from Paul Desmond, the saxophonist here. His tone is almost akin to that of like a classical saxophone tone sometimes. Next we have the weird one out of the bunch of the 1959 albums here, Ornette Coleman's Shape of Jazz to Come. This is the album that gave that Refused album its title as well. The lineup here is Ornette Coleman on alto saxophone, Don Cherry on cornet, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. And you'll notice there's no piano or guitar or any chord instrument, and that's part 1 of what makes this album so freaky. This is really the album that sparked the avant-garde jazz movement proper. I wouldn't call it free jazz because there is still a really strong time component to a lot of the tunes here, but the improvisational concept here is almost entirely focused on melody and almost no harmony whatsoever. There's a quote from Charlie Hayden in the Ken Burns Jazz documentary where he talks about how he and Ornette Coleman would like play with each other in his apartment, and he'd say like, you know, just play the changes that you hear, don't like worry about any sort of changes, just play what you think I'm playing. That was really the idea that made The Shape of Jazz to Come such a strange album. It was met with a lot of rebuke from Ornette's contemporaries at the time, but years later it's proven to be really influential. And eventually the avant sound would sort of expand from here, and we would get the album Free Jazz in 1961, which gave free jazz its name. So as the 1960s come around, things are starting to change. You know, we had Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album of all time by most metrics, and eventually from here a sound would start to be solidified kind of in the mid to late 60s called post-bop, but we're going to approach that from 1961 with John Coltrane's album My Favorite Things. There's so many really good John Coltrane albums, like, you know, the one that everybody raves about is A Love Supreme, and that's one of my favorite albums of all time, but I think My Favorite Things is really the best starting point. It's not quite as harmonically complex as stuff on Giant Steps or even Blue Train, and it's not quite as avant-garde as Africa Brass or A Love Supreme or Ascension or anything like that. So if you're really trying to get in the traditional sort of jazz sound, My Favorite Things is really where you want to go. Really the highlight of the album here is the title track, My Favorite Things. It's this really modal sort of arrangement of the song from The Sound of Music, and it would become one of Coltrane's trademark tunes, and he would take it to some very strange places as his ideas about improvisation expanded. Now we're going to talk about one of the great jazz drummers and one of the great small groups of jazz of all time, the Art Blakey Jazz Messengers. This is the album Caravan that I'm recommending today. The Jazz Messengers were a really premier combo from the late 50s, let's say, up until when Art Blakey died in 1990. And I'm just gonna list off some of the more noteworthy members here. Horace Silver, Lee Morgan, Benny Golson, Wayne Shorter, Freddie Hubbard, Cedar Walton, Keith Jarrett, Woody Shaw, Mulgrew Miller, and countless others all got their start with this band or made their names solidified under Art Blakey's leadership. The lineup here is Art Blakey on drums, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Curtis Fuller at the trombone, Wayne Shorter on tenor saxophone, Cedar Walton at the piano, and Reggie Workman on the bass. This is a really excellent example of the sort of solidification of what would become the post-bop sound. It's not quite there yet. The music's starting to become a little more adventurous, slowly and slowly. I'm gonna recommend another Miles Davis album now. This one is Miles Smiles. The group here is Miles Davis again, Wayne Shorter again, along with a rhythm section of Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. This is a group that's been called Miles Davis's second great quintet. It's one of Miles's most musically, harmonically adventurous bands, but also one of their least charismatic, unfortunately. They're really more of a band for musicians by musicians, but it's still a really interesting sort of sound that they create with this album. Around this time, the post-bop thing was really being solidified. The real trademark of this sound is that instead of playing the chord changes to a song, you would play around the changes, and that proved to be a very influential idea in Miles's group and in plenty of other groups that would follow. But if you're looking for something a little bit less kind of esoteric, I would recommend you Speak No Evil by Wayne Shorter. It's an easier listening, more straightforward sort of post-bop sound, and it's actually got 3 members of the second great quintet on it. There's a lot of Wayne Shorter in these 60s recommendations, but you know, he was really the main voice of the saxophone in the 60s, aside from John Coltrane, who's, you know, I would put him in a different category of musicianship, honestly. And you know, I am a saxophonist, so sorry if I'm a bit biased. So the post-bop thing started to really take off in the 60s, but then somewhere along the way, Miles Davis came back again and had another idea, and that was to take these sort of evolving, growing jazz sounds and combine them with the ever popular genre of rock music to get something called jazz fusion. I'm gonna recommend In a Silent Way as a good example of this. This was the first album of what is often called the electric period of Miles's career, and I think from this point on, pretty much everything he did was rooted in some sort of fusion. Now again, a lot of people would say Bitches Brew is the more historically immaculate, relevant, whatever album, but you know, it's a 90-minute listen, and you know, of course I really enjoy, again, it's one of my favorite albums, but In a Silent Way is a bit more concise and a bit more straightforward, which I think makes it a much easier listen than going into Bitches Brew for the first time, which can be really disorienting. Important musicians here include John McLaughlin, who would later form the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which is another great band that you want to check out if you're into this sort of rock music with jazz, progressive rock, anything like that. And also Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock are both on this one playing electric pianos. And lastly, I'll mention Joe Zawinul, who plays organ on this album and would later go on to form the seminal fusion act Weather Report. This is just a really good album if you're looking for something with a lot of atmosphere and a really driving sort of chill groove. Another big development around the 70s was the ever-growing popularity of third stream, which is a term that was coined by Gunther Schuller in 1957, I think, and it describes jazz music combined with classical music to create this sort of hodgepodge. And one of the big innovators here was, again, Charles Mingus. A lot of his albums from around the time of The Black Saint and The Sinner Lady, which is another amazing record, but a lot of albums from that point onward would increasingly be part of the third stream sound. A really great example of third stream, like real like classical and jazz hybrid, is Let My Children Hear Music. It's a collection of music that Mingus wrote for a really grand scale sort of size jazz orchestra. It's not like an orchestra plus a jazz band, it's just a really big band. And a lot of this music is much more composed than jazz tends to be, although there are a lot of moments that are improvised and often quite freely improvised as well. And I mean, this was Mingus's favorite album that he ever did, so, you know, can't be that bad. In the sort of avant-garde world, we have an increasing trend that sort of came out of avant-garde jazz and free jazz. Spiritual jazz is often what it's called. This is a Pharoah Sanders album called Black Unity. Pharoah is often said to be part of the holy trinity of free jazz sort of tenor players. The quote from Albert Ayler is, John Coltrane was the father, Pharoah is the son, and I am the Holy Ghost. And I mean, Albert Ayler is great, but he's very out there, and I mean, Coltrane's late work is out there, a lot of Pharoah's work is out there, but this is pretty approachable if you approach it with an open mind. It's one 37-minute long driving groove with a few occasional sort of interruptions for some freer moments that are kind of freaky. Again, the more popular Pharoah album is Karma, but Karma is really hard to wrap your head around the first time you hear it. So if you want something that'll just hit you straight between the eyes, go with Black Unity. And lastly, I'm gonna give a little tip of the hat to Jazz Funk, Herbie Hancock's Headhunters from 1973. It's kind of like fusion, it's just funkier. It makes sense, I guess. There's a lot of moments on this album that are really chill, and there's a lot of them that are incredibly intense. I think my favorite moment here is the saxophone solo on the song Sly. Now, if you just watched Ken Burns' Jazz, which is a really interesting documentary series, or if you studied jazz academically, you'd think that the genre hasn't really advanced meaningfully since 1975, since that's where a lot of the history on the genre sort of stops. But there have been plenty of great albums that have been released since 1975, so I'm gonna go through a few albums that I like from the 80s and the 90s, and I think are exemplary of jazz moving forward in many ways. First of all, we have Wynton Marsalis's Black Codes from the Underground. Wynton is currently the director of the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, which is one of the premier big bands in America and in the world. He's really done a lot for jazz education across America, but this is a much earlier Wynton from 1985. It's got this really characteristically modern sort of sound, which presents a really interesting kind of evolution from even like Speak No Evil or something like that. I mean, and of course, if you think how far we've come since Jazz at Massey Hall, compare Jazz at Massey Hall to something like this, and it's really night and day. I'm gonna shout out the debut solo project from Michael Brecker, who is often thought to be the most important tenor player since John Coltrane, and again, I have a hard time disagreeing with that. He's accompanied here by a sort of super group, Kenny Kirkland on piano, Charlie Hayden on bass, who played with Ornette, Jack DeJohnette on drums, and Pat Metheny on guitar, who I'll be talking about again in just a moment. This is just a series of really excellent performances from Michael and everybody else involved. This album is actually from 1997 next. This is Kenny Garrett's album Songbook. It's a quartet album. Kenny Garrett is sort of like beast mode personified in a saxophonist. This is just a really amazing set of tunes and a really great set of performances. A lot of really catchy melodies if you're looking for a real like melody. Fusion is still trucking along. We're gonna talk now about Pat Metheny. This is his album with the Pat Metheny group called Still Life Talking from 1987. Pat Metheny is one of my personal favorite musicians. I see him as sort of like a a compositional guide in many ways. He's got this really extensive musical vocabulary that pushes far outside the boundaries of simple jazz. This album in particular deals with a lot of Brazilian rhythms and musical elements. I would describe Pat Metheny's sort of sound as this really sort of signature, trademark kind of lushness, really musical quality to it as well. But if you want something a little bit more hard-edged, you can go with Hard Hat Area by Alan Holdsworth from 1993. This guy is sort of a musician's musician as well. His playing is probably the most harmonically and rhythmically complex out of anybody that I'm going to be talking about here. But I think there's actually a lot of common ground that fans of bands like Atheist or Cynic or that sort of progressive metal sound would really enjoy here. Another guitarist once again, this is Kurt Rosenwinkel's album Heartcore from 2003. We're getting pretty modern now. This was actually co-produced by Kurt and Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest. Kurt Rosenwinkel lays down some guitars on the second track from Q-Tip's album Kamal the Abstract, which was delayed for a while, and I think Kurt tapped him shortly after that to work on Heartcore. Most of the instruments here are played by Kurt. He's usually a guitarist and he's a very good one, but here he contributes a lot of drums and keyboards, and there are a lot of songs here that are just him, although he's accompanied every once in a while by members of his regular quartet. The harmonic texture here is no doubt influenced by a guy like Pat Metheny, but a lot of the textures here, whether they're harmonic textures or just timbral textures, are actually influenced by Arnold Schoenberg. It's not quite as strange as Schoenberg, but it's still really this marvelous tapestry. And if you want interplay out the ass with some incredible pocket, you gotta check out Ultra Hang by the Chris Potter Underground. Chris Potter is probably the premier tenor saxophonist since Michael Brecker, who was the premier since John Coltrane. You know, the lineage of tenor people continues, and I enjoy keeping up with that. This group's sound could best be described as free funk, I guess. This is a band comprised of Chris on tenor saxophone along with Rhodes keyboard, drums, and guitar. There's no bass or anything. There's this really heightened sense of communication between all four members of this group, and it's just incredible. So now we are pretty much at the present day. Ultra Hang was in 2009, but you know, what does the current landscape look like, you might be asking? So I'm just gonna shout out a few of my favorite modern records here that are good to listen to if you're into what I've already mentioned before and you just want some new stuff, then here you go. First, I'm going to talk about Ben Wendell's album Frame. Ben is a saxophonist and bassoonist who has worked with the band Knee Body in the past, who are really interesting if you're looking for a band that is truly not bound to any one genre. He was classically trained up until the time he went to college, so he wasn't really introduced to jazz for a while, and I think that classical training really comes through in his compositional style and even his approach to his instruments. I say instruments because he also plays bassoon. He's like the only jazz bassoonist I can think of, or maybe like a few others, but I mean, you know, props. And if you enjoy what you see here, he's also got a music video series called The Seasons that features a lot of up-and-comers. Really great music video series, but, you know, Frame is the album that I'm recommending, so Frame. Next, I'm going to talk about Donnie McCaslin's Casting for Gravity. This is a pretty trademark Donnie McCaslin sounding album, and if Donnie McCaslin's name sounds familiar, it's because he was the tenor saxophonist who led the band that was David Bowie's backing band on Black Star. So if you enjoy anything about Black Star, you should definitely take a dive into Donnie McCaslin's library, specifically this album. This is a band that you've probably heard of before. This is Snarky Puppy. I'm going to shout out their album We Like It Here. Michael League, their bassist and leader, describes them as a pop band that improvises a lot without vocals, and that really is true in many ways, but they're also sort of a genre-bending band. They take a lot of elements from fusion and funk and jazz and rock and a lot of world music elements as well, and they've got this really excellent sort of like jam band quality as well. So you may have seen Corey Henry play the everlasting shit out of Lingus on YouTube, but the rest of the album is also very good. I specifically really enjoy Bob Reynolds' solo on Outlier. He's the guy with the headphones that fall. There they go. He's also got a YouTube channel that I think is really interesting for people who are interested in jazz or just making a living as a musician or just general musicianship. Go check out Bob Reynolds' vlog series. And if you don't know this album already, I think you should. It's Kamasi Washington's The Epic. Do I have it on CD here somewhere? Yes. Got it on CD over here, and it's also over there. You know, what is there to say about this? I mean, I think Kamasi is a really up-and-coming sort of guy. He did a lot of arrangements and playing on Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, which was where he really got his name solidified. But he's been playing with various big bands and other sort of groups for a while. He's really indebted in his playing to the sort of spirit of Pharoah Sanders and Rahsaan Roland Kirk, that really sort of spiritual thing, in contrast to that kind of post-bop tradition that can get a little bit academic and esoteric sometimes. Kamasi just plays straight from the gut, and it's really awesome. This album is full of grand scale compositions accompanied by an acoustic and electric rhythm section. He's got a double rhythm section, a small string section, and a small choir. It's just this really grand sort of sound. And if you're into that sort of sound, you may also enjoy Stretch Music by Christian Skatatunde Ajua. I hope I'm getting that right. The sound of this album is really influenced by the post-bop thing, by the fusion thing, but also electronic music and hip-hop. I would describe the sound here as being really futuristic. And finally, I'll just give a brief mention to In My Room by Jacob Collier. I've already praised this album to hell and back, and you know, it's really still one of my favorite albums recently. I think Michael Rowlands was actually talking to me one time, and he was like, man, I just wish he'd chill out and play a blues sometimes. And it's like, well, you know, helicopter. I mean, while that is true, I think he's really pushing the boundaries in a really interesting way in terms of these really complex sort of theoretical things that he does. He's got this great interview that you can watch where he just talks about all these crazy music theory concepts that I find really interesting because I am a nerd. So, those are the albums that I'm recommending to you, but what would be my top 5 starting points out of all this? I said I would be recommending 5 albums, I'm gonna do it. So I think number 1's gotta be Ella and Lewis. This is just a really irresistible kind of feel-good, old-school sort of album. It's just got such, it's got such charm and wit and sort of delicacy. It's all so great. I'm gonna recommend Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, of course. I mean, in many ways, this is the single album that ushered in, like, the rest of jazz history. And I'll also recommend Speak No Evil by Wayne Shorter. It's this really kind of cool, calm, and collected thing. It's this really great example of the post-bop kind of 60s sound. A lot of great solos and playing and communication. And I'll also recommend a second Miles Davis album. I know it's cheating, but this is No Kind of Blue in a silent way. It's an album that I think will definitely be of interest to people who are interested in like 60s and 70s rock and funk music, although it's sort of flipped on its head in a really fascinating way. And if you're just a general fan of music, you don't really care too much about genres or any sort of thing like that. I mean, if you just enjoy music, listen to Still Life Talking by the Pat Metheny Group. It's an album that I think anybody who's interested in any sort of genre is going to be able to take something away from. I mean, Pat Metheny has this way of writing music that makes it almost timeless. Like I said, he draws from all these different genres, like just so far outside of jazz that it's just this really brilliant kind of sound. So those are my 5 jazz recommendations. There's a lot of my jazz recommendations. If I missed out on something, or if you want more recommendations, or if you want me to talk more about jazz in any sort of way, then, you know, do let me know, because I had a lot of fun putting this list together. If you listen to any of these albums and you find them to be interesting in any sort of way, or if you have any questions about them, you know, you can feel free to comment. So, yeah, jazz. I'm still not gonna make that joke. So this is the video that's really officially kind of kicking off the summer for me. I'm gonna try and have 2 videos a month out from June to August, so hopefully this will be a pretty productive time for me. I'd like to thank the patrons, as usual, whose names are scrolling by over here. Once again, that is the first link in the description if you're looking to support what I do. There's also a PayPal link there, and all my social medias are linked down there as well, so if you want to peep me over there and say hey on Twitter or something, I mean, you can do that. So, happy listening, everybody, and stay legend.